Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And well, we're finally here. The topic that I've danced around a fair bit with hardcore punk, but one that really is quintessential for understanding a significant part of the scene. And like with most things hardcore punk, it got chronically misunderstood or stigmatized by organizations and systems that are not willing to see nuance within the scene, and unfortunately partially consumed from within by complications at the core. Yep folks, we're getting political here again because it's finally time we talk about straight edge. And with all of it comes a huge disclaimer from me. I'm not straight edge. I probably never will be. I don't smoke because lung cancer and heart disease killed my grandfather who smoked his entire life. And I don't do drugs mostly because I'm not really interested or I really have a lot of the time or money to get into the scene. But I'll admit it, I like craft beer. I like good wine. I like entirely too much bourbon. And I also know folks who are both edge and ex-straight edge. And I've got no room for judgment for either group. Not only is it emphatically not my place, the choice to go edge is an individual one made for a multitude of different philosophical reasons, and one, for the record, I actually really respect. Also keep in mind that in the early 1980s, when straight edge began as a true grassroots movement, it was on some level reactionary, sure, but that does not diminish its power or relevance at that time. Coming out of the late 70s and the very early 1980s, a lot of punks died from drug and alcohol abuse. And when you factor in that most of the hardcore punk scene was in their late teens and very early 20s, younger than me sometimes by about a decade, it's completely understandable a broad action was taken without a lot of consideration for what straight edge could become throughout the rest of the decade or into the 90s. And if we ever talk about Earth Crisis on Resonators, I'll weigh in a lot more significantly on the more, let's call it, complicated activist side of the movement. But in the early 1980s, it was a movement designed to help protect a lot of kids from substance abuse that most were not prepared or educated to handle, and provide them a space where they were not marginalized for not partaking, both in the bands and outside of them. And as such, when straight edge advocates say that straight edge probably saved a lot of punks' lives at that time, yeah, you know what? I tend to agree with that. And that's pretty kick-ass. So today, we're going to talk about the artist that coined that phrase, straight edge, in a 1981 song of that title, Washington, D.C. native Ian MacKaye and his band Minor Threat. Now, I do not have enough time to go into a full history of Ian MacKaye here. Again, if we get to Fugazi on Resonators, I'll speak more about him. But in 1981, he was gaining traction with the second of his bands, Minor Threat. Also worth keeping in mind, he was 19 at that time, and he was already running his own DIY label, Discord Records, which is around to this day, where Minor Threat released 2 EPs in 1981, and almost by accident started the local straight edge movement. He also racked up some negative publicity for a song called Guilty of Being White, and if you remember some of the conversations surrounding race from the Bad Brains episode, also a Washington DC band, you might understand why this might have been a little bit controversial in hardcore punk. Now, to Ian MacKaye's credit, I do find that it's not intended to be read as racist, especially in the local DC scene, but man, the song has not aged well, and when you factor in how straight edge was already starting to become more of an activist movement at the time, especially with some of the correlations made with hardcore and street punk, well, it's no surprise that Minor Threat went on hiatus while founding guitarist Lyle Presler went to college. But the band reformed after he completed one semester, and they started recording the album we're going to be talking about today. The only full-length album released by Minor Threat, and nowadays widely touted as one of the most influential albums in hardcore punk, not to mention one of the best. That's right, folks, we're talking about Out of Step by Minor Threat, and this is Resonators. So let's get this out of the way first. Of all the hardcore punk records I have covered on this show, Resonators, thus far, this is probably the one that I like the most. It's incredibly lean, tight, and well played, and it manages to step up to the plate with a level of refinement and nuance and the content that I can really respect. Even if at first listen, most of the whole straight edge business I referenced early on entering this review, it doesn't really come into play until the title track. Hell, it's barely on this album at all. The title track's the 8th out of 9 songs. And even then, Ian MacKaye is far from being militant on the subject, which ties into one of the big reasons why I can argue this album holds up pretty well. Universality. Like with Black Flag, Minor Threat doesn't link themselves to the politics of that time. And hell, given at how many points Ian MacKaye wonders how detached he feels from the passage of time on this album, that kind of makes sense, but it also has the benefit of the populism and long-term relatability, balanced by the brutal pragmatism and DIY maturity that came to characterize a lot of Ian MacKaye's later work. Take the opening song, Betray. It almost seems like he expected the double cross coming, but instead of playing into the game of it, he's confronting the issue, dealing with the person, and just ending things. And when you follow it with It Follows, highlighting the drama that is stuck around within the scene. You can almost taste his raw exasperation. You thought we'd be past all this high school bullshit. Hell, go to the closing song with Cashing In, where he focuses his rage on those who think that Minor Threat reformed in 1982 to sell out, when in reality, A, a lot of the complaints seem rooted in local jealousy that really made little sense even at the time. B, hardcore punk didn't sell huge numbers in the early 80s anyway. C, Minor Threat would only ever release this full-length record before breaking up. And D, those complaining would all show up at the DC shows anyway, so again, stop bitching. But what really helps here is Ian MacKaye is fully aware that some of this probably is his fault. He knows something changed with those friends that were left behind and look back and laugh, or even him not changing, and he hopes that they might be able to resolve things in the future and talk it out, but he is willing to own it if it is him that's the problem. And while he might hold on to some of that stubborn pride on the indecipherable conflict of no reason because that pride is all he really feels he has, he also knows that not talking is so immature and stupid that it all seems. And when you pair with those who will look down on hardcore punk for having all been done before on Think Again, kind of ironic this only dropped in 1983, the hipsters were already there, but Ian MacKaye might accept some of the blame there, but he sure as hell is not going to take those who dump on his scene and sound under airs that they really haven't earned or understand. Now this maturity does lead to the one slightly weaker song for me with Sob Story, basically calling out somebody whining at never getting the lucky break and then telling them to pull their shit together and work hard and you will make it. But it kind of makes sense given how ruthlessly pragmatic this album can feel, even if that can be a little bit of an isolating feeling, as referenced on the title track and Little Friend. And that title track is where we get the most explicit straight edge reference. And really, it's more an acknowledgement of the confusion that somehow by not indulging, he can't keep up with the larger popular consciousness, that larger world. But hell, at least he can think, and for him, in that scene, it's good enough, and I respect him for that. Oh, and the music is pretty damn kick-ass too. And for a record running about 20 minutes, there is not a moment to spare, and Minor Threat make the most of all of it. Killer kick drum rhythms from Jeff Nelson driving the chugging, borderline thrash riffs off Brian Baker, and a lead guitar that might not give Lyle Preslar a lot of time or space to flex out on solos, but opens up so many of these songs with a really sweet melody that ensures the majority of these tunes have a real anchor point. And that focus on melody should not be overlooked. Think Again and Cashing In, they might have monster hooks, but Look Back and Laugh gets a lot of stability out of that slower melody that builds into the song, or the jagged, rattling riffs that spark into Little Friend, or the sparking elements between the chorus and verse on It Follows. Hell, they even managed to find time to ram in a tonal shift into Betray that slows the rhythm line down a little bit, but still fits perfectly together in the song. But if you remember something most out of step, it's the bass lines. And while I'm not sure if it's more linked to influences from fellow DC natives Bad Brains, I cannot deny how much Steve Hanskin's meaty bass lines anchor so many of these songs. From punching up beneath the melody on Betray and It Follows, how much curdled, surging energy gives songs like Think Again and No Reason, to how it even anchors behind Ian MacKaye's vocals on the title track. And this is where I do have one small nitpick about the production. While I do like a lot of Ian MacKaye's delivery, his mix placement of the vocals could have afforded to be a little bit more multi-tracked, if only for the hooks. No Reason and Cashing In, they do this wonderfully. And it really could have made some of these songs just stand out all the stronger here. It would have sounded really great. But again, that's nitpicking on a record that thus far on Resonators most easily deserves the term classic to this day. It's only just over 20 minutes, but it doesn't waste a moment with the insanely catchy hooks, the terrific playing, the solid production, and writing that really hit that righteous balance between fervor and nuance that only the best of hardcore punk could really deliver in this lane. And it made sense that Ian MacKaye might have felt kind of out of step with his larger scene. His writing had a foundation of pragmatic maturity that has colored his entire career, and the alienation at this epicenter on this album provided a resonance that really has lasted to this day. And for me, it's a solid 9 out of 10 and absolutely essential if you're into hardcore punk, straight edge or otherwise. I have yet to hear much hardcore punk that is better than this record, and for me, on Resonators, that's high praise indeed. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. You want to check out the record? Link down there below. Buy this shit. It's awesome. This guy's still doing DIY to this day, 30, 40 years later. That has to be respected. And beyond that, I got the poll up there. I'm curious where you guys fall on this because, again, one of the best. This record clearly deserves to be called a classic, and I hope the poll reflects that. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in voting on the next episode of Resonators or help impact my schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details on the schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Resonators on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.